Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 165, and it's titled Hatchery Sliver Combo. I'll be honest, I couldn't think of a clever name for this one, so if you think of one, let me know in the comments down below. But if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card of the week is going to be, shocker I'm sure, Hatchery Sliver, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2 sliver. It has Replicate for 1 and a green, so when you cast this spell, you copy it for each time you paid its Replicate cost, and each sliver spell you cast has Replicate, and the Replicate cost is equal to its mana cost, and notably, a copy of a permanent spell becomes a token. You might be wondering why I'm focusing on that in particular, but that will become quite apparent later on. So, as the title of the video mentions, this is a combo deck, and in order to get our combo rolling, we had to add some colors with our commander, and more specifically, we did pick a 5-color commander, but in this case, we wanted them for the ability because we are using Rukarumel Biologist. And yes, she is all 5 colors. She's white, blue, black, red, green for a 3/3 legendary creature, human wizard. As Rukarumel Biologist enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Slivers you control and non-token creatures you control are the chosen type in addition to their other creature types. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. Then she can pay 3 and tap and create a 1/1 colorless sliver creature token. So that's a lot of text on this card, but the main reason we really want it is because of that ability to turn our creatures into all other creature types, and that is exactly what we're trying to do. So if we had, for example, a Hatchery Sliver that gave other slivers Replicate, we could name Sliver as Rukarumel comes in, making all of our creatures slivers. And that is exactly what we want to be doing, which sounds a little counterintuitive because it already gives slivers the ability, but Hatchery Sliver is actually the only sliver in the entire deck, so we want to make sure that the other creatures in our deck can benefit from Rukarumel's ability, and therefore are viable for the combo that we want to pull off. And so speaking of the combo, let's jump into our themes, and we'll kind of pick apart why this is a combo deck focused on Hatchery Sliver. And that is because we are running as many creatures that have 0 mana value as possible. And the reason that is because Hatchery Sliver specifically gives Replicate to other slivers, and the Replicate cost is equal to their mana value. So if we cast something like Memnite, which is simply 0 mana for an artifact creature construct, it's also a 1/1, then we can pay the Replicate cost, which is 0, as many times as we want because we don't actually have to spend mana for it. Meaning that if Hatchery Sliver and Rukarumel are both in play with Rukarumel on slivers, we can cast Memnite and make infinite copies of it immediately. Now, the problem with that is that we now have an infinite army of 1/1s, and all someone has to do is untap, board wipe, and there's nothing we can really do. So our second theme is going to be finding ways to win with our infinite tokens. And one of the main ways we're actually going to be doing that is through sacrificing them. We have a huge sacrifice package in the deck because we do generate a lot of tokens just naturally throughout the course of the game. So we want to make sure that we have ways to win and ways to sacrifice our creatures for value. And Goblin Bombardment is a great combination of the two because it is 1 in a red for an enchantment that just says sacrifice a creature. Goblin Bombardment deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So if we make infinite Memnites, we don't have to wait a turn to untap and then attack. We can just sacrifice them all to do 1 damage infinitely to everything at the table, including our opponents, and win the game outright right there. Now, there are other ways we can do this. We have ways to scry by sacrificing. We have ways to mill by sacrificing. So there's a lot of things that we can do to win. Goblin Bombardment just feels like the easiest and cleanest way to do that. And then, of course, we're going to move into our final theme of the deck, which is going to sound a little disconnected from the first two, and that is going to be landfall. Because we're a 5-color deck, I wanted us to have a way to win that wasn't just the combo, and so we're playing a lot of landfall creatures and also a lot of cards that search our library for basic lands, even though we are a 5-color deck, so our mana base is pretty stacked with basics to take advantage of those effects. And then we want to use cards like Avenger of Zendikar to also pump out a ton of tokens, because Avenger of Zendikar is 5 green for a 5/5 elemental. When it enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. Then it also, of course, has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. So while Avenger itself doesn't make tokens when landfall is triggered, it makes the tokens that it has already created much bigger. Most of our token generators in this deck, though, are landfall token generators, which means that when we play a land, we're going to get a token, so we can sacrifice those to Goblin Bombardment, do some damage. We can use those to attack. And honestly, one of the biggest reasons we're playing so many landfall token generators is to make those look like the threat in our deck. We want our opponents to feel like they have to remove the Avenger of Zendikar instead of Rukarumel or instead of the Hatchery Sliver, because we want to make sure that we can combo off. And so if we push a little bit of that aggro onto our landfall creatures, that's a great way to force our opponents to use their removal on things that we don't really care about. But at the same time, they're going to be cards that will win the game eventually, so our opponents do have to deal with them. So that is the main synergy behind the deck. That is how we want to win. We want to make infinite tokens with Hatchery Sliver and 0 mana value creatures, but I want to highlight some key cards that are in the deck that also really help the deck do what it wants to do and also find ways for it to combo. So the first card I want to talk about is actually probably the best finisher in the entire deck, and that is Brutaclad Telcore Engineer. Brutaclad is 4 blue-red for a 4/4 legendary artifact creature Artificer. Creature tokens you control have haste. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 2/1 blue mirror artifact creature token. Then you may choose a token you control. If you do, each other token you control becomes a copy of that token. So earlier, I mentioned that it's very important that the copies of the replicated creatures, in this case the Slivers and the 0 mana value creatures, come in the battlefield as tokens. That means that with Brutaclad, he's going to give them all haste, meaning they can attack immediately. So if we have an army of Memnites, they're all attacking for 1 damage, makes that lethal damage. But if we're being honest, most of the 0 mana value creatures have no attack. They have 0 power, there's nothing they can do to get in damage. And the second ability of Brutaclad makes a 2/1 token, and then all of our replicate tokens can become a copy of that 2/1 token, plus they all have haste, meaning we're now swinging with an infinite army of 2/1 mirrors. And that immediately ends games, unless someone has an Aetherize, which you should always be playing Aetherize. But if nobody has that, then you're good, you get in all the damage, and you're good to go. So Brutaclad is definitely one of the best finishers in the deck, just because it provides the haste and it also provides the damage. And it's very rare to find a card that can do both. Moving on from Brutaclad, though, into our second key card, this one is Dig Up. And normally I wouldn't put a tutor on the key cards list because it's just a way to find some of our combo pieces, but I think Dig Up deserves a little bit of praise for the things that it can do in the deck. So Dig Up is 1 green for a sorcery, and it also has Cleave for 1 black green, which means that we can cast it for its cleave cost. If we do, we remove the words in square brackets. So if we just cast it for a single green, it says search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. This is a great way to mana fix early in the game because we do have a lot of basics and we are a 5-color deck, so this is phenomenal early game when we just need to find lands. And then if we cast it for its cleave cost, it becomes search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So once we've got all of our colors, once we're not worried about our mana base and having to cast our spells, this just becomes a tutor that can go and get Brutaclad if we need a finisher. It can go and get Memnite if we need a 0-drop, or the Hatchery Sliver if we need it. It's a great way to really get us anything that we need and make sure that it's useful at all parts of the game, which is very, very important for our 5-color mana base because, like I said, all those basic lands are great when it comes to searching them up, but they're not so great at mana fixing. So we need to find ways to benefit from that early on, and Dig Up is a great way to do that. Now, finally, moving into our last key card, this one is Witty Roastmaster. So another way to win the game is by making all these tokens and then having something like Witty Roastmaster in play, so that way we don't even have to worry about going to combat. We don't need to worry about having a sacrifice outlet. All we've got to do is just make the tokens and we win. Because Witty Roastmaster is 2 and a red for a 3/2 Devil Citizen. It has Alliance, so whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Witty Roastmaster deals 1 damage to each opponent. So presumably, if all of our opponents are at their starting life total of 40, we would need 40 creatures to come into play in order to win the game with Witty Roastmaster, which sounds like a lot, but then you remember we can make infinite tokens with our Hatchery Sliver combo, and if we can just make infinite tokens, that means we can do infinite damage. So Witty Roastmaster is a great backup win condition, especially because, like I mentioned earlier, our opponents could have an Aetherize, they could have a Fog, they could have some way to prevent combat. Even just a Ghostly Prison is enough to stop us from killing someone in combat. Witty Roastmaster doesn't care about any of those things. Witty Roastmaster will still end the game no matter what. So, before I go too long into talking about how great Witty Roastmaster is, which it is, put it in your decks that make tokens, but before I get too deep into that, let's move on to our next piece of this deck tech, which is going to be talking about some cool interactions. And these are the cards that synergize so well together that I wanted to make sure they were highlighted in the video, and in some cases are just kind of cool cards that don't get a lot of love in most places. This first combo, though, definitely sees a lot of love, and that is between Cole the Forgemaster and Shuko. So when I started building this deck, I realized that we really had a ton of 0 mana value creatures, and so why not throw in another 2-card combo that plays well with all of the creatures we were already playing. So Cole the Forgemaster is red and white for a 2/2 legendary creature dwarf warrior. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, if it was enchanted or equipped, return it to its owner's hand. Then, token creatures you control that are equipped or enchanted get +1/+1. The second part of that ability is completely irrelevant to us, but if we combine that with Shuko, which is 1 mana for an artifact equipment, equipped creature gets +1/+0, and it equips for 0, which is the most important part of this card, we make an infinite combo with any of our 0 mana creatures. Because if we have, say, a Memnite, we cast it for 0, we equip it for 0 with Shuko, and then if we have a sacrifice outlet like Goblin Bombardment, we sacrifice the creature, do a damage to an opponent, the Memnite returns to our hand, we recast it for 0, re-equip it for 0, and then we repeat the process until every single one of our opponents is dead. And that is not necessarily an easy combo to pull off, but considering we have a ton of tutor effects in our deck to be able to get our Hatchery Sliver combo, I figured this is at least a backup win condition that involves a little bit less setup. It still involves some setup. It's still a 4-card combo, but it's at least a little bit easier than trying to find just random 0 mana creatures and then also the one of Hatchery Sliver and then also a way to give haste and things like that. So I wanted to make sure that there was at least a backup, but like I said, it is an infinite combo, so if you're not a big fan of infinite combos, this is an easy one to remove, but in all honesty, if you are not a fan of infinite combos, then, you know, the Hatchery Sliver combo deck might just not be the thing anyway. Hopefully, still kind of cool though. Anyway, moving on to our next cool interaction, this one is going to be between Scute Swarm and Decimator of the Provinces. So we mentioned earlier that the landfall synergies are typically a way to kind of remove aggro from our pieces that we really want to be using, but sometimes they just win the game on their own. And that is the case with Scute Swarm and Decimator of the Provinces, because Scute Swarm is 2 and a green for a insect, it's a 1/1, has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that's a copy of Scute Swarm instead. So you can kind of see how this gets out of hand, because if we just have 6 lands and 1 Scute Swarm, we play a land, we now have 2 Scute Swarms. Another land gives us 4, then 8, 16, 32, so on. So we can get a ton of Scute Swarms very, very quickly. And then with Decimator of the Provinces, which is admittedly a massive 10 mana for a 7/7 Eldrazi boar, it does have Emerge, so it's 6 green, 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 so we can sacrifice a creature and reduce the Emerge cost by that creature's converted mana cost. When we cast Decimator of the Provinces, creatures you control get +2/+2 and trample until the end of turn, plus the Decimator itself also has trample and haste. This is a great way to turn our 32 1/1s into 32 3/3s, and that is a huge spike in power, because now instead of doing just 32 damage, we're doing 96 damage, which is enough to take out 2 players from their starting life total and really put a dent in the third. So if that doesn't win us the game right away, we still have plenty of other things that are going on, like the Witty Roastmaster, like the Hatchery Sliver and the Brutaclad. So this is a great way to just end the game if things are going too long, if our opponents have given us too many turns with Scute Swarm. And it's nice to have a combat win condition that isn't technically an infinite combo, although I will say Scute Swarm will probably get a lot of hate just in general, so keep an eye out for that. But anyway, those are all of our cool interactions for this week, and the next thing we've got to do is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, our deck's price came in at $90.29, so we did come pretty close to our budget limit. And our most expensive card takes up about 10% of that just on its own, and that is Altar of Dementia. And that is 2 mana for an artifact, sacrifice a creature, target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. This is, once again, another win condition if we make infinite Memnites with Hatchery Sliver, because now we are able to just sacrifice the creature, and then all of a sudden, our opponents have to mill equal to its power. And while most of our 0 mana creatures do have 0 power, Memnite does not, and of course we have ways to buff up the power of some of our creatures, so this is just a great way to mill out our opponents, and another backup win condition that is not combat related, just in case people have an answer for combat. Now, with that being said, if you do want to trim down the price a little bit, you can cut Altar. There are plenty of other sacrifice outlets, and it doesn't do a lot all of the time. It really needs a specific setup. So it is very expensive for a less useful sacrifice outlet in the deck, as weird as that may sound. So that is a suggestion for you. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit out of budget, and a card that I would recommend maybe taking out for it, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So this week, the card that I would recommend putting into the deck if you can is going to be War Leader's Call, and the card I would recommend taking out is Hithlane Rope. So War Leader's Call is 1 red, white for an enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. So this is very clearly a phenomenal card for this deck, because not only does it give our creatures +1/+1, meaning all of our 0 mana creatures can take out our opponents, it also does 1 damage to each opponent when a creature enters, so if for some reason our opponents don't die to the damage, we still have combat. And if for some reason they can blow it up, so, oh, we can't do combat damage, it doesn't matter because the creatures have already entered and already done the damage with War Leader's Call. Now, unfortunately, or I suppose fortunately, depending on your point of view, War Leader's Call does see quite a bit of play in both Pioneer and Standard at the moment, which I think is causing its price to be a little bit inflated. So this is a card that I would keep an eye on in the future if you're looking to pick it up. I can't imagine it will go up too much more, but there is a chance that it drops in the future as well. Now, with all of that being said, if we are putting in War Leader's Call, We do, of course, have to take a card out, and that card I would recommend is Hithlane Rope, which is 2 mana for an artifact. It can't be sacrificed, and you can pay 1, tap it, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. The player to your right gains control of Hithlane Rope, and pay 2, tap, draw a card. The player to your right gains control of Hithlane Rope. When I originally put this in here, I kind of just wanted to test it out. It seems like a card that could go around the table pretty effectively, could help ramp, draw cards, but in practice, I haven't found that it actually does as much as I want it to. Very often, you get to do one thing with Hithlane Rope, and then it's kind of just gone, and you're probably not going to see it again before the end of the game. And paying 3 mana for a basic land or 4 mana to draw a card and then letting your opponents do the exact same thing is not really what we want to be doing. So I was really hoping this card was going to be a lot better than it actually is. If, in your opinion, this card is a lot better, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear some success stories of Hithlane Rope, but as far as I'm aware from my own testing, I haven't seen it do what I want it to do. So unfortunately, I would recommend cutting it and putting Warrior's Call in instead. But that brings us to the end of our deck tech, and so before we get into the game with this deck, because we do got to test it out and see how it actually performs, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. You can, of course, just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But if you're looking to find us on some social media platforms, you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, send me an email. And then you can also, of course, support us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you'll get to join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Richard, and Devin Purser. So to all of you that are already supporting the channel, thank you so much. And to everyone, of course, who just likes and subscribes, thank you as well. You are also incredibly important to the success of this channel. But if you're looking to get a little bit extra out of it, if you join the Patreon or right here as a channel member, you get things like the deck lists a week early, you get the unedited gameplay videos, you get to join a Discord where we brew up a lot of the decks, and also where we actually play a lot of the games. So if you want to show up on any games in this channel, that is a way to do it. Plus, you get a random card sent to you every single month. I have fallen behind on that a little bit, but we're getting there. They just got sent out yesterday, so for anyone waiting on those, they are on their way. But with all of that being said, I don't want to ramble on too much, so let's get into our game. Now, our opponents this week, we are joined, of course, by 3 opponents, are going to be the Wise Mothman, being played by Cole, Depala, Pilot Exemplar, being played by Doodle, and Timna the Weaver and Ravo Soultender, being played by Richard. So starting off with the Wise Mothman, this is just a rad counter deck, so Cole wants to give his opponents as many rad counters as possible, mill people out, put a ton of counters on Mothman, and just start hitting people with a giant insect while milling them out at the same time, kind of hitting on multiple axes, being able to do some damage and also remove some threats at the same time with the mill. So I've played against Wise Mothman a couple of times, and I've got to be perfectly honest, this is by far the biggest threat at the table to us. Mothman just completely snowballs out of control. It is an incredibly powerful commander. I've never played in a game with Mothman where it did nothing, so I would be willing to bet that at the end of the day, the Wise Mothman is probably our biggest threat here, and that's probably where I'm going to be trying to focus a lot of my attention. Moving on, though, we do have Doodle playing Depala, Pilot Exemplar, of course, a man after my own heart. Depala is one of my personal favorite commander decks. I absolutely love Depala. She's phenomenal. So in Doodle's build, he is doing what Depala wants to do. He's got a ton of dwarves, he's got a ton of vehicles, and he just wants to put his dwarves in his vehicles and just run people over. So I know that Depala can often kind of fly under the radar. People see it and they're thinking it's not that bad, it's not super strong, vehicles aren't super great, dwarves aren't super great. And then all of a sudden there's a huge army of vehicles staring you down and there's not much you can do about it, and it just keeps drawing cards and keeps being aggressive. So that's my way of saying we should definitely not count out Depala. I think the only issue that Doodle's going to run into in this game is that based on the other two decks, which we'll get to Richard's in just a moment, this is definitely going to be a game that is won by flying creatures. And the reason I say that is because, of course, we have Mothman, but Richard's deck of Tymna and Ravos is what he calls his Batman deck. This is quite literally a bat-typal deck, so he wants to play as many bats as possible and just kind of fly in at his opponents and do some damage. And so he's going to use Tymna as a way to draw some cards. He's going to use Ravos as a way to pump up his creatures and also get them back from the graveyard. But he really just wants to play a ton of bats. This is quite literally the Batman deck of the table, trying to take down the vigilantes of the Wise Mothman, Depala, and of course the Hatchery Sliver Rukarumel combo. So I'm not sure what to expect from this, but knowing Richard's brews, I'm sure it's going to be very strong, and I'm definitely interested to see what bats can do. I probably can't even name more than like 5 bats in Magic off the top of my head, so I have no idea what to expect. But let me know down in the comments what you think of the deck so far, what you think of everybody else's decks as we go through the game, and of course, get your predictions in now. How do you think this game's going to go? Who do you think's going to walk away with the victory? But other than that, I hope you all enjoy it. I'm sure I certainly will, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Cole goes first, followed by myself, Doodle, and then Richard. On Cole's first turn, he plays a Temple of Deceit, scrying 1. I play a Seaside Citadel. Doodle plays a Mountain. Richard plays a Grim Climb Pathway and then cast Vampire Bats. Cole plays an Overflowing Basin. I play a Forest and cast Rampant Growth, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Flywheel Racer. Richard plays a Tainted Field and casts Gurmag Swiftwing, using it to attack me for 1 since it has haste. Cole plays a Forest and casts Tato Farmer, letting him get 2 rad counters whenever a land enters under his control. I play a Mountain and cast Shield Sphere. Doodle plays a Plains and casts his commander, Depala Pilot Exemplar, giving his other dwarves and vehicles +1/+1, and also letting him pay X mana when she's tapped to look at the top X cards of his library and put all vehicles and dwarves from among them into his hand. Richard plays a Swamp and casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver, letting him pay life in his post-combat main phase equal to the number of opponents that were dealt damage this turn. Then he can draw that many cards. This lets him attack Cole for 1 and pay a life in his second main phase to draw a card. Cole plays an Exotic Orchard, getting 2 rad counters, then casts his commander, the Wise Mothman, giving each player a rad counter when it enters and when it attacks, then also putting a +1/+1 counter on a number of creatures he controls, equal to the number of non-land cards milled. On my turn, I mill a land for my rad counter, then I play an island and cast my commander, Rukarumel Biologist, naming Slivers when she enters so that all my creatures are Slivers in addition to their other types. At the end of turn, Doodle uses Depala to crew the Flywheel Racer, using it to pay 1 mana for Depala's ability, revealing the top card of his library, but it isn't a dwarf or vehicle, so it goes to the bottom of his deck. Still at the end of turn, Cole activates Tato Farmer to put my Crumbling Necropolis from my graveyard onto the battlefield under his control. On Doodle's turn, he mills a non-land, losing a life and his rad counter, while Cole puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. Doodle then plays a Plains and casts Weatherlight. On Richard's turn, he mills a non-land, losing a life and his rad counter, while Cole puts another counter on Mothman. Then Richard plays an Isolated Chapel and attacks me for 1, letting him pay a life in his second main phase to draw a card. In his second main phase, Richard casts Changeling Outcast and then also casts Selfless Glyphweaver, which can exile itself to give his other creatures indestructible until the end of turn. On Cole's turn, he mills 1 land and 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on both Mothman and my Shield Sphere. He then plays a swamp, getting 2 more rad counters, and moves to combat, attacking Richard for 6 with Mothman, giving each player a rad counter. Then Richard blocks with his vampire bats, killing it but taking no damage. In his second main phase, Cole cast Hancock Ghoulish Mayor, giving each other creature he controls that's a zombie or mutant +1/+1 for each counter on Hancock. On my turn, I mill 2 non-land cards, losing 2 rad counters and 2 life, while Cole puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and on Tato Farmer. I then play a forest and pass. On Doodle's turn, he mills a non-land, losing a life and his rad counter, while Cole puts another counter on Tato Farmer. Doodle then casts 7 dwarves, which gets +1/+1 for each other 7 dwarves he controls, and taps Depala to crew Weatherlight, paying 2 for her ability, but unfortunately still not finding a dwarf or vehicle. He then attacks Richard for 5 with Weatherlight, looking at the top 5 cards of his library when it deals combat damage, revealing a historic card from among them. In this case, a Mighty Servant of Lyoko, putting it into his hand. On Richard's turn, he mills a land, then plays a swamp and moves straight to combat, attacking Cole and I both for 1. Before the damage though, I cast Jaheira's Respite, preventing all combat damage, and searching my library for a basic land since there's 1 creature attacking me, putting it into play. In his second main phase, Richard casts Deep Cavern Bat, making me reveal my hand and letting him exile a card from it until the bat leaves play. This has him taking the Dig Up from my hand. Then at the end of turn, Cole activates Tato Farmer, returning Orzhov Basilica from Richard's graveyard to the battlefield under his control, and returns a forest to his hand. On Cole's turn, he mills 2 lands and 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, removing 2 rad counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and Vampire Bat. He then attacks Doodle for 8 with Mothman, giving each player another rad counter. In his second main phase, Cole replays a forest, getting 2 more rad counters, and casts Inexorable Tide, letting him proliferate whenever he casts a spell. On my turn, I mill a non-land, losing a life, a rad counter, and letting Cole put a +1/+1 counter on Tato Farmer. I then cast Shuko, equipping it to Rukarumel to give her +1/+0. On Doodle's turn, he mills a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and letting Cole put a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. At the end of turn, Richard cast Anguished Unmaking, exiling Inexorable Tide and losing 3 life. Then, on Richard's turn, he mills a land and a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, while Cole puts a +1/+1 counter on Tato Farmer. Richard then moves to combat, attacking Cole for 1 and me for 2, gaining a life with Deep Cavern Bat. Then, in his second main phase, he pays 2 life to draw 2 cards with Timna, and also casts Jet Medallion, making his black spells cost 1 less. After that, he casts Dusk Hunter Bat, which has Bloodthirst 1, so it enters with a +1/+1 counter since an opponent was dealt damage this turn. Finally, he casts Wand of the World Soul, which can tap to give the next spell he casts Convoke. And at the end of turn, Cole activates Tato Farmer to put Richard's Swamp from his graveyard into play under his control. On Cole's turn, he mills 2 lands and 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, 2 rad counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and my Shield Sphere. After that, he plays Mariposa Military Base and casts Power Fist, equipping it to Mothman to give it trample and putting a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the combat damage it deals to an opponent. Then he attacks Richard for 10 with Mothman, giving each player another rad counter and putting 10 more +1/+1 counters on Mothman. At the end of turn, I activate Rukarumel to create a 1/1 Sliver token. Then, on my turn, I mill a non-land, losing a life and a rad counter, while Cole puts a +1/+1 counter on Tato Farmer. At the end of my turn, Doodle uses 7 dwarves to crew Flywheel and Depala to crew Weatherlight, paying a total of 5 mana for her ability and putting Surge Hacker Mech into his hand from the top of his library. On Doodle's turn, he mills a non-land card, losing a life, and a rad counter, while Cole puts another counter on Mothman. Doodle then casts Fairgrounds Warden, exiling Mothman when it enters the battlefield. Cole has a response though, casting Mutational Advantage, giving his permanents with +1/+1 counters hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn, preventing all damage that would be dealt to them and proliferating. On Richard's turn, he mills 2 non-lands and a land, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and letting Cole put a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and Hancock. He then attacks Cole for 1, me for 2, and Doodle for 1, letting him gain 1 life and pay 3 life in his second main phase to draw 3 cards. After that, he plays a Path of Ancestry and casts a Foundry Screecher. Then, in Richard's end step, Cole activates Tato Farmer, putting a Plains from Richard's graveyard into play under his control. On Cole's turn, he mills 2 lands and 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and Hancock. He then attacks Doodle for 26 with Mothman, knocking him out of the game with commander damage, and putting 20 more +1/+1 counters on Mothman since 6 is blocked by Weatherlight. On the way out though, Doodle casts Boros Charm to do 4 damage to Cole. In Cole's second main phase, he casts Sir Conrad the Grim, doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from anywhere, or if a creature leaves his graveyard. After that resolves, he casts Maddening Cacophony, kicking it to mill each opponent for half their library rounded up. In response, Richard convokes Heliod's Intervention to gain 12 life, then the Cacophony resolves and has us milling more than enough non-lands for Cole to put a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures, and then since we each mill a total of 16 creatures, Richard and I both take 16 damage from Sir Conrad. At the end of turn, I cast Roiling Regrowth, sacrificing a land to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped, then I also activate Rukarumel to make another Sliver token. On my turn, I cast a Maria Angel, letting me make a 1/1 bird token whenever I play a land, and cast Case of the Stashed Skeleton, making a 2/1 skeleton token and suspecting it. Richard plays a Vault of the Archangel, and casts his commander Ravos Soul Tender, giving all his other creatures +1/+1. He then attacks me for 3 with Timna, and attacks Cole with everything else for 15, gaining a life and then paying 2 life in his second main phase to draw 2 cards. After that, he mutates Dirgebat on top of Gurmag Swiftwing, destroying Mothman when it enters, doing 1 damage to each of Cole's opponents with Sir Conrad. On Cole's turn, he mills 3 lands, then casts Rise of the Dark Realms, putting all creatures from all graveyards into play. Notably, this doesn't kill us with Sir Conrad, but since I have a Witty Roastmaster in my graveyard, it does 1 damage to both Richard and I for each creature that enters because of the Rise of the Dark Realms, doing 20 damage to each of us, knocking us both out, and winning Cole the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on in that game. We got very unlucky right from the get-go that we couldn't find our second black mana source, which that is the downfall to playing a lot of basics in a 5-color deck, so we couldn't cast Dig Up for its cleave cost, meaning we couldn't go get the Hatchery Sliver, which was a shame because we did have Memnite in our hand, meaning that we could use Rukarumel to make infinite Memnites, and then if our opponents didn't have an answer, we just win the game on our next turn. But that wasn't quite to be, and then once we had the Dig Up taken from us, we didn't really do much the rest of the game. We couldn't find a lot that was actually going to forward our game plan. We got stuck on mana, we couldn't find any threats, so it wasn't a great game for Hatchery Sliver. But it is worth noting that we did come very close to winning. We just got unlucky and got pretty much thought seized by Deep Cavern Bats to take away the tutor that we needed. So I think that it's a deck that really could use a little bit of tune-up, but I think the main thing that it has is very powerful and is worth maybe powering up just a little bit. So if you're interested in this deck and you have some suggestions for how to power it up, or maybe out of budget ways to power it up, I would love to hear any feedback, because this is a deck that I think I might throw together myself and keep in my personal collection just as a way to kind of have some fun at some tables. So let me know what you all think of that. But otherwise, we gotta talk about everyone else's decks as well. So Doodle, unfortunately, also kind of got stuck on mana. He really didn't find much. He only cast 2 vehicles the entire game and just couldn't find a way to get things rolling. He kept whiffing off of Depala, which I think is probably the biggest issue that he was having, because I think at the end of the game he looked at, I want to say about 7, maybe 8 cards and only found 1 vehicle the entire time, which, you know, given Depala is not what you want to be doing. So he really just got unlucky, unfortunately. Moving on to the Batman deck, I think the Bats did surprisingly well. I do think the trouble that Richard ran into is that there really wasn't a ton of power among the Bats. They were 1/1s and 2/2s and even a 0/1. So there wasn't a ton of power, which I think is where Ravos comes in. But it was neat to see a lot of these cards that really don't see a ton of play, and a creature type that also doesn't get a lot of love. So that was a ton of fun. And then, of course, last but not least, our winner, the Wise Mothman and Cole. Once again, Mothman keeping up his undefeated streak on the channel, currently 2-0. As I mentioned, Mothman, incredibly powerful, being able to just make a ton of +1/+1 counters just from kind of sitting around and doing nothing, I think makes Mothman a huge threat, and people tend to underestimate just how big it can really become and how quickly it can become super big. So that is definitely a commander to watch out for, and a bit of a spoiler alert for future videos. We actually have our own Mothman coming up on the channel in just a few weeks, so if you're interested in seeing our Dungeon Learner's Guide build of Mothman, just wait a little bit and check it out. But I'm not going to give you any more details than that because that's too many spoilers. So with all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching the video. Thank you all for liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And if you have any comments, please do put them in the comments below. And of course, let me know if there's anything that you think could be improved about our deck. So once again, thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide. The main reason is because we are running as many creatures that have 0 mana as possible. What the heck just happened there? What was that? Why did it do that? What? Oh my god. Okay, hang on. Did that fix it? Okay. Oh, Jesus. Okay, anyway.